What's going on, gamers? It's Village here from Beneath the Veil and welcome back to the channel. This week I wanted to do a quick little two-part series about 7 habits of highly effective support and core players, and this week we're going to start with supports. The goal of this little mini-series of videos is to give players who are focusing either on the support roles or the core roles 7 core concepts to focus on, and then as you go through each one and make each one a habit, it should make you a better and better player as things go on. You will notice that the 7 things I'm going to give you today do all start to interact as you start to make more and more of them a habit, but these are ordered in what I think is the best order to start mastering them, and then you should start seeing results from there. The most important habit, and what will drive the most decisions for you, is paying attention to the in-game clock. As you can see, it's part of the HUD, it's up here in the central part of the screen. Pretty much every single decision that you want to be making as a player should be dictated by some sort of timing. So in the very early game, there'll be things like your stacking and pull times, there'll be all of your objectives as well, will all be time-based now. Things to think about are, obviously every minute you can stack a camp, and then every 2 minutes, there's going to be either a water rune or a power rune. Every 3 minutes, there's going to be lotuses and bounty runes that come up. And then every 7 minutes, there's going to be wisdom runes. Pretty much at every minute of the game, there should be something for you to be doing as a support player. And you'll start to find that a lot of those things will start to interact. So for example, if you're going for the wisdom rune at 7 minutes, then you can stack the ancient camp that's nearby it, assuming that it's your ancient camp. If you're going for the lotuses, then, you've got to be cognizant of the fact that there's the bounty rune as well. So you might want to talk to the support whether they want to rotate for the bounty rune to refill their bottle. But that's, things to consider and communicate with your team around timings, what you're going to get, what you might want the core to go and get, and then how you can split up those resources to leverage smaller advantages in the early laning phase. Other things to consider is that if you're playing around Tormentors, so you want to try and get the shards as quickly as you can, the first Tormentor will spawn at 20 minutes, and then after you kill the Tormentor, it will be 10 minutes until the Tormentor will respawn. And then obviously with Roshan, whenever Roshan is killed, the Aegis will expire within 5 minutes of Roshan being killed, and then Roshan will respawn somewhere between 8 and 11 minutes. So what a lot of people will do is that the second Roshan dies, they will just alt ping the clock, and that will bring up a message in chat about what the time is, and then you can copy and paste that. You can add 8 to 11 minutes to it, and then you can just copy and paste that so that whenever you're thinking about taking Rosh again, you can always check to see whether it's in that possible respawn window. So habit number 2 is what I've called TPing with purpose. So a lot of low elo players will end up dying, and then their response will be just to immediately TP back to their lane in the early laning phase. There tends to be a lot of situations where that is not the ideal scenario. So now with the addition of the twin gates on the edge of the map, it's even more viable for supports if they die to then rotate to the other outer lane and try and help secure a kill in that lane before rotating back through the twin gate to their lane. Other things to consider is that you can TP mid if you want to give your mid laner a bottle refill because they might have missed the rune for whatever reason. Or you might want to TP mid to help secure the rune if it's near the time that a power rune would be spawning. Other things to consider is that whether your allies have their TP on or off of cooldown. So as we covered in one of my HUD's tips and tricks videos that I did for the channel, if you hold Alt, you can then see the TP status of all of your allies. So you can always ping out their TP or just comm to somebody. If you need a lane defended, for example, you might comm out to your core, hey, can you go and defend our bot tier 2 so that you don't have to do it? And then, they're getting gold. They might have just not been paying attention to the minimap. With a bit of presence of mind as a support player, you can start making those calls to get your cores rotating a bit more economically to slowly leverage those GPM advantages. And then also a lot of those instances will stop the instance where you'll have multiple cores TPing to the same lane, and then they're not efficiently splitting up gold. So our third tip is moving around the map in general with purpose. What does this mean exactly? Well, since we're not TPing out to lanes because we want to be holding our TPs to TP in for a gank, TP in to save a support, save a core, TP in to help refill some sort of resource, that means we're going to be running around the map a lot more as a result. What does that leave us open to? Well, if we go back to our first concept about watching the time, we now have all of these extra camps around the extremities of the map that we can look to leverage, right? So you might want to stack a camp on your way back to lane, for example. You might want to rotate to the wisdom rune because you know that, for instance, now it's going to be spawning, right? So there's a whole fight breaking out over here because of that resource, right, coming up. So in lower elos, players aren't going to be as good as players up in Immortal, for example, like they are here, are about fighting for those resources. A lot of times just by simply moving around the map with the purpose of knowing that certain resources are going to be available at certain times will just naturally net you advantages and allow you to passively carry your team through the small advantages that you're leveraging. There are other things like if we're going to smoke for some deep vision, perhaps. So we might decide that we don't really have the lineup to get value out of an early smoke gank. So you might want to use one of your smokes instead to get some deep vision so that maybe you can leverage that in 2 to 3 minutes when a power spike comes online. So habit number 5 is regularly checking and clearing the shop of consumable resources. All of these consumable resources are super helpful, especially as a support player. You don't want to be playing in lane as much, so you can get much more value out of things like clarities than core players can, because they're expected to, stand in lane a lot more and open themselves up to the potential of getting a clarity cancelled compared to a core who normally can be, hiding in trees or something while a clarity regens them. So generally the only one that I wouldn't really suggest clearing out of stock is mangoes, unless you want to take mangoes and then feed them to your allies. Generally you get better value as a support out of clarities, because as you're rotating around the map, you can pop a clarity to help mana regen, right? Other things to consider is, as we talked about before, you've got smokes that are a regenerable resource, so you want to try and, wherever possible, make sure that you don't have those sitting on max stock, and then same with sentries and wards. So I'd always use it as a rule of thumb to not necessarily completely empty the shop of every single resource, but just make sure that it's not getting to the point where you're getting max stacks occurring. So for things like smokes, that's 3. For things like clarities, tangos, and mangoes, that's 4. And then for observer wards, it's 4 as well. And for sentries, it's 8. You always want to make sure that you're keeping that supply below its cap. And then you're actually using those resources, right? Because typically, if people don't have them in their inventories, then they're not going to think to use them. So if you're making sure that you're regularly picking them up, then that can be a really good way to make sure that you're placing more of them out on the map in general. A good tip for this to get into the habit of it is that I started working into a routine that every time I died, I would always check the shop. And then every time I would go to TP, I would always check the shop as well. Or anytime I was waiting to do something, right? So if I'm standing at the wisdom rune and it's like 10 seconds until the wisdom rune spawns because I'm early, then I'm checking the shop. If I'm channeling a lotus orb pickup, then I'll go and check the shop. And it's just getting that reflexive habit of hitting your shop hotkey and just scanning the consumables section, and then you can just close it out again. It's just getting you into the habit of checking regularly so that you don't get those stacks building up without you realizing. So habit number 5 is monitoring enemy and ally item progression. So the reason this is really important is for a couple of reasons. So number 1, you want to be aware and cognizant of how all of your cores especially are doing throughout the course of the game. And then you want to be trying to use your consumable resources, like your smokes, for example, to leverage all of your advantages based on your allies' item timings. A core like, for example, Bat Rider in this instance, if he's playing around the Blink Dagger timing, then you would want to be making sure that you're in constant communication with your Bat Rider about, hey man, do you want me to pick up a smoke so that once you've got your Blink, we can look to make a play with it for a reveal? Or is there something else that you want to pick up before you start making that play, right? Or you could be looking to play around your, in this instance, Pangolier. He might be going for a Maelstrom or something like that, and you might want to try and make a play around that timing. The other thing to consider is what your enemies are building and when those items are online. So there might be certain enemies that you've got kill threat on until they get a certain item timing online. And then there might be other instances where you need to counteract their item pickup by an item pickup of yourself. So for example, if you're playing against a 4 Skywrath mage who's going Atos, start building towards a 4-star so that by the time the Atos comes online, you can negate the effect of it, right? So a lot of those instances, you need to be cognizant of what the enemy team is building, so that you can then create counterplay, because that's just how you naturally leverage advantages. Other things to consider is what your allies are already building, and then what items you can build on top of that to help synergize. So there are things like that to consider in terms of how your itemization can work together, and then how you can create counterplay on the enemy team, and then also when you can or can't kill certain enemies based on what items they have. Habit number 6 is monitoring enemy positions throughout the course of a game. As a support, it's typically expected that you're not going to be doing as much as cores are within a game in terms of being constantly active and needing to, pay attention to the center of your screen. So you're not going to be doing things like farming, for example, where you need to be aware of somebody suddenly attacking you. You're typically going to be doing things like stacking camps. You're going to be running around the map, setting up vision, things like that. So typically you've got a lot more time to briefly scan the minimap and collect and track info in the broad sense of the term about where the enemies should be on the map. You should have some sense of which quarter of the map enemies are within a range of 10 seconds or so. So the way I would advise splitting it up is that if you split the map down the middle based on the river and then based on mid lane as well, then you've basically got 4 quadrants, right? So you should be able to track pretty much all the time or within 30 seconds whether an enemy has been in the northern quadrant, the eastern quadrant, the southern quadrant, or the western quadrant. And that should help you make a lot of your decisions about where you want to play, right? You can see the Underlord's just shown in the bot lane, so we know that he's around there. We had some info on Spirit Breaker being top before. We've got Chaos Knight as top, so we've got at least 2 in the northern quadrant. We've just seen Spirit Breaker down in the western quadrant, going over to the southern quadrant. So you've got constant ideas about where enemies should be, and then sure enough, there's a fight breaking out here, right? Because they've got some numbers that we can then work to counteract. So we've moved as a team. We know that there's an advantage there because the Chaos Knight shouldn't be with them, right? So even though we didn't have vision there, we still got a really good fight because we've leveraged an advantage based on information that we've gathered passively from the map, right? And this is why for cores, it's really good to be constantly de-pushing waves so that they naturally push into enemy territory and force enemy responses, because anytime somebody shows on a wave, that's free information. Anytime they show on a ward, that's information, but you can't really stop yourself from showing on a wave, right? Whereas if you're playing around wards, they can de-ward it and then you've lost that info. So it's really good for supports in general to be keeping tabs about where people generally are, because it will help create counterplay. And generally, if you haven't seen the enemy team in a while, that should sort of cue you that they're either, trying to take Roshan or they're declaring their Tormentor. They're doing some sort of objective rather than just passively farming all of the time. And then the last habit of highly effective supports is all about positioning. So positioning is a very broad term and can change contextually depending on what phase of the game you're in. So generally, as supports, if you're playing a save support, for example, you don't want to be showing on you don't want to be showing in general until you need to use your skills to save an ally, because typically the best counterplay for the enemy team is to kill you first, right? So if you're playing heroes like Dazzle or Oracle, you always want to be hiding in trees, not showing until you need to come out to use your big save abilities. If you're playing heroes like Initiators, then you typically don't want to be showing first because you want to get the jump in some sort of way, or you want to get the counter initiation, right? And the best way to shut you down is to jump you before you get a good initiation or a good counter initiation. And then in terms of laning phase, there's things like whether you trade better into the enemy team than they trade into you, in which case you want to be postured aggressively so that you can start trading. And if you trade worse, then you want to be positioned on the other side of the lane from the other support so that they can't trade with you. That's all stuff that comes with time and comes with knowledge of laning matchups. But that's something to constantly be thinking about as well as, am I positioned well here? Am I under vision? So have I cleared vision to make sure that I'm not being seen if I don't want to be seen? Am I making sure that I am seen if I want to be seen? Maybe you want to be jumped because you know that an ally can save you. Or you've got something like a Yule's to, intercept their initiation in some degree. So that would be my list of the 7 most important aspects to improve as a support player. If I were you, I would write these down and I would just keep in mind that, for the first, say, 10 games, I'm going to focus just purely on keeping track of the time. And then once I feel like I've got that really solidly into my muscle memory of anytime I'm not doing something, I'm checking the time and thinking about what timings are available, then that's when I'd move on to the next step, and so on and so forth. And you'll find that as you start to get more and more of these under your belt, they'll all start to naturally intertwine. And then you'll start getting much more value out of your games where you are playing support, because you're naturally leveraging advantages, you're keeping track of information, and that creates counterplay for not only you, but your entire team. So yeah, I hope that helped. As always, if there's any questions, drop them in the comments below, and me or a member of the team will get back to you. Besides that, I will see you in the next video.